So, one important topic I'd like to cover with everyone today is the network of alliances that the Spaniards built with indigenous people after arriving in Mexico. When the Spaniards first arrived in Mexico, they actually didn't come by themselves. They did bring along Taino natives from the Caribbean. And we do know that at least one of the conquistadors was of African ancestry, a man named Juan Garrido, who was actually born in West Africa. He was actually a free man when he arrived in the Americas, and he served as a conquistador in Cortez's expedition. And I'm sure you're well aware of La Malinche, also known as Doña Marina. She served as Cortez's interpreter as he made his way through central Mexico. But there's actually a lot more to the story. Cortez didn't just make alliances with people like the Tlaxcalans and have native guides such as Malinche. He actually had a network of alliances that he built from the coast of Veracruz all the way to Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. What Cortez noticed as he journeyed across central Mexico was that many of these groups in the region held lots of resentment against the Aztecs. You have to remember the core of the Aztec dominion was that island that they lived on in Lake Texcoco in central Mexico. That island was called Mexico. And on that island, there were two towns. There was Tenochtitlan, the capital, and there was also Tlatelolco. So, with very few exceptions, much of what they controlled outside of that island was won through conquest. So, all of these towns across central Mexico that were within the Aztec dominion, they had a historical memory of, at one point in their past, not being under the control of Tenochtitlan. And part of that control that the Aztecs had over their neighbors entailed exacting tribute from them, like tax payments, and then also handing over people for human sacrifice. Now, there were many other cultures in the region that practiced human sacrifice, so that wasn't necessarily a uniquely Aztec thing. But the arrangement that the Aztecs had with these groups in the region, these people were taken through coercion. So when Cortez arrived in the Valley of Mexico, central Mexico, he stepped into a pre-existing regional conflict. So there were some groups that very early on allied with these foreigners. The most notable of these is the Totonacas, actually not the Tlaxcalans. The place where he first encountered the Totonacas was the area that is now known as the Mexican state of Veracruz. So this was very early on in his arrival to central Mexico. And in my opinion, this relationship with the Totonacas was even more important than his relationship with the Tlaxcalans, because it was the Totonacas that introduced Cortez to many other towns in the region and also helped to negotiate a peace treaty with the Tlaxcalans. Now, for many decades in this field of research, people have pointed to this and said, oh, this is a classic example of divide and conquer. In my opinion, and the evidence bears this out, Cortez did quite the opposite. He united groups and went to go conquer the Aztecs. For many of these groups around that time, they had never had an alliance with one another, but they had something in common. They were under the yoke of the Aztecs. Cortez basically became a broker among all these different groups. When we view scenarios like this through a racial or political lens, you might ask yourself, well, why would all these natives ally with a foreigner, ally with the European? You have to remember, these groups did not hold a homogenized view of themselves. They all had different origin stories. They had different traditions. In many cases, they had different languages or different variants of the same language. So many of these groups simply did not share an idea of a common origin. Homogenizing native people of that time as having the same interests or the same cultures or the same governments, those ideas are more or less modern interpretations, and they're incorrect interpretations. And this division amongst themselves is not uniquely a Native American thing. Even in Europe at the time, Europe was at war with itself. Europe has been at war with itself up until, World War II, right? So it's safe to say that Cortez did use effective diplomacy skills in navigating the situation with all of these different groups. Remember, Cortez was not the first Spaniard to reach what is now Mexican soil. There were other ships that had arrived before him. But those Spaniards who arrived before Cortez weren't able to accomplish what Cortez achieved. And the story of these alliances didn't actually end with the conquest of the Aztecs. The Spaniards and their allies continued to form more alliances all across North America as they went throughout the region conquering. And as I mentioned in a previous video, the Aztecs themselves were divided in how to approach the Spaniards. There were the people behind Moctezuma II who wanted to form a peace treaty with the Spaniards, and there were the people behind Cuauhtemoc and Cuitlahuac who wanted to fight back against the Spaniards. Obviously, that faction that wanted to resist, they lost. But after the conquest, the Spaniards did find people to collaborate with amongst the Aztecs in their leadership. And so in 1522, the very next year after the conquest, those Aztecs who were now allied with the Spaniards, they helped to negotiate a peace treaty between the Spaniards and the Purépechas, who were the other powerful empire in the region. And so by 1522, Cortez had done what no one else was able to do. He united the most powerful tribes in central Mexico, the Tlaxcalans, the Aztecs, and the Purépechas. In 1522, the Spanish monarchy officially made Cortez the captain general of New Spain, Nueva España. And so here was Cortez, who was captain general of New Spain, but he had very few Spaniards under his command. The vast majority of the people in his army were Tlaxcalans, Aztecs, and Purépechas, and to a lesser degree, the Otomi people. Remember, at no point in this scenario are the Spaniards the majority. They are a very, very small minority in all of Mesoamerica. And that was the case for the entire 300 years of the colonial period. There was never a time where Spanish people outnumbered the native people. Even in 1810, at the start of Mexico's War of Independence, 60% of the population was still identified as Native American. And even Mexico's War of Independence, it was not initiated by native people. It was initiated by criollos, who were Spaniards that were born in colonial Mexico. And so that's why, interestingly, in Mexico, among historians, there's a very popular saying that the conquest was actually carried out by the natives and independence was won by the Spaniards. Now, going back to the topic of native alliances, the most important group amongst all these natives for the Spaniards were the Tlaxcalans, of course. This military support provided by the Tlaxcalans was not limited to colonial Mexico. They also helped to conquer Central America, South America. They joined expeditions that went as far up as Alaska. These native allies, particularly the Tlaxcalans, but also the Purépechas, Otomi people, and of course the Aztecs, who were now in alliance with the Spaniards, they also helped to fight against the nomadic tribes of northern Mexico. These nomadic tribes were known as the Chichimecas. These military conflicts with the Chichimecas went on from around the time of the 1540s all the way up until 1590. And finally, the Spaniards negotiated a peace treaty with these nomadic tribes to help end the war. The Tlaxcalans also helped to conquer the Philippines. If you remember, the Philippines was also part of the Spanish Empire. Well, when it was initially conquered, the people who went on the expedition were native soldiers. That Spanish expedition that conquered the Philippines, it actually left from the coast of what is now the Mexican state of Nayarit. It didn't come directly from Spain to the Philippines. The people on those boats were mostly people who were born in Mexico, both criollos, Spaniards who were born in colonial Mexico, and native warriors, mostly the Tlaxcalans. In fact, the ships that sailed to the Philippines to go conquer it, those ships were built in Mexico with Mexican wood. The wood to build those ships, that wood was chopped down in the forests around Jalisco and Nayarit. When it comes to building ships, the wood in Mexico is actually of much better quality than the wood in Spain. There is much more variety in Mexico to choose from. So when we reflect on the history of New Spain or Nueva España, native people were part of the nation-building process from the very beginning. When you're researching the history of your family, it's really effective to dig into the history of your hometown. Was your hometown built by Tlaxcalans during the colonial period? Because if that's the case, you probably descend from the Tlaxcalans. The Spaniards typically settled alongside their allies. They didn't oftentimes settle next to enemy tribes. My Spanish ancestors settled in Michoacan, and the Purépechas of Michoacan, for the most part, were the allies of the Spaniards. And the Purépechas took part in many military conquests all across North America to help build Nueva España. So we as Mexican people, we all have very different family histories. We all identify as Mexican now, but the histories of our family are all very unique to our families. Remember, the idea that we all descend from the Aztecs or we're all from Aztlan, those are more or less political ideologies. I know a big part of Mexican identity, it's even on our flag, is Aztec symbolism. But in reality, most of us do not descend from the Aztecs. That doesn't diminish the importance of the Aztecs in Mexican history, but the reality is every region of Mexico has its own very unique history with very unique cultures. And so when you're studying your own family history, it's important to also study the history of your region and also the history of your hometown. But I guess I'll leave the conversation right there for today. Thank you all for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.